RAF. Cosford sits in the Shropshire countryside, about 2 hours northwest of London, and inside one of its hangars rests an aircraft that should have been cut apart with blowtorches 40 years before the museum even opened. The airframe carries no engine, no avionics, no ejection seats. It never flew. What it carries instead is a serial number, XR220, and a story that makes very little sense until you understand who wanted it dead. In 1962, the British Aircraft Corporation completed the first prototype of the TSR-2, a low-level strike and reconnaissance aircraft designed to penetrate Soviet air defenses at Mach 2.5 and deliver a nuclear weapon with pinpoint accuracy. The aircraft could fly at 200 feet above terrain at nearly the speed of sound using an automated nav-attack system that wouldn't appear in American cockpits for another decade. Its terrain-following radar, its forward-looking infrared, its side-looking airborne radar. The TSR-2 packed sensors into a single airframe that the United States Air Force hadn't even finished specifying for its own next-generation bomber. The British, for perhaps the last time in the 20th century, had built something that leapfrogged American capability. That was the problem. If you think you know why this aircraft died, drop it in the comments right now. Subscribe so you catch the full story, watch through to the end, hit like if I change your mind, and share it with someone who cares about Cold War aviation. The conventional explanation runs like this. The TSR-2 cost too much. The Labour government under Harold Wilson cancelled it in 1965 to save money, and Britain bought the American F-111 instead. Clean narrative, tidy politics. Almost none of it holds up under scrutiny. The cancellation order came with a secondary directive that rarely gets discussed. The destruction of all existing airframes, all jigs, all tooling, all production fixtures. Not mothballing or storage, destruction. 16 airframes in various stages of completion at the Weybridge and Preston factories received the order. Workers who'd spent 3 years building those aircraft watched them hauled to scrapyards within weeks. It felt like a funeral, one BAC engineer told an interviewer decades later. Except at a funeral, you keep the photographs. Someone allowed 2 airframes to survive. The records don't say who made that call or under what authority. XR220 ended up at Cosford. XR222 sits at the Imperial War Museum, Duxford. Every other trace of the production line vanished so thoroughly that when historians later tried to reconstruct the aircraft's technical specifications, they found entire filing cabinets had been emptied. Not misfiled, emptied. Why would the United States government care whether Britain built its own tactical strike aircraft? Britain bought American hardware all the time. Phantoms, Hercules transports, Polaris missiles. The relationship flowed mostly one direction, and Washington liked it that way. The TSR-2 threatened to reverse that flow. Several NATO allies, including Australia and West Germany, expressed serious interest in purchasing it. A British-built strike aircraft selling on the international market meant lost contracts for General Dynamics, lost leverage for the State Department, a disrupted procurement hierarchy across NATO, and a precedent that Robert McNamara's Pentagon found alarming. An allied nation building superior military technology and then competing with American firms for NATO contracts. That wasn't partnership. That bordered on commercial insurgency. McNamara's Department of Defense applied pressure through channels that stayed informal enough for deniability but pointed enough to land. The British government cooperated. The airframes burned. And at Cosford, behind a rope barrier, XR220 sits in climate-controlled silence with its empty engine bays and its missing records. Evidence of something that almost worked too well. The aircraft must be capable of delivering a nuclear weapon after approaching the target at low level at a speed of not less than Mach 1.5. General Operational Requirement 339, issued by the Air Staff in 1957, runs to dozens of pages. The panic is in that single line. The English Electric Canberra had carried Britain's nuclear deterrent across European skies since 1951. A beautiful aircraft, smooth lines, twin Avon engines, a ceiling above 48,000 feet that Soviet interceptors struggled to match through most of the decade, and handling qualities that made pilots genuinely fond of it. Canberra crews trained to fly high and fast over Soviet territory, drop their weapons, and turn for home. The plan worked as long as Soviet radar stayed primitive, and their surface-to-air missiles stayed unreliable. By 1957, neither condition held. The SA-2 guideline had entered operational service around Moscow and Leningrad. Its engagement envelope reached altitudes above 60,000 feet. Gary Powers wouldn't prove the point until 1960, but RAF intelligence officers already understood the math. A Canberra cruising at 45,000 feet at 470 knots moved through a kill zone that stretched dozens of miles in every direction around each SA-2 battery. The Soviets planned to deploy hundreds of them. Wing Commander Roland Beaumont flew Canberras in the early 50s and later became the TSR-2's chief test pilot. He described the shift bluntly. The RAF's entire strike philosophy had become obsolete between one budget cycle and the next. Aircraft designed to fly above the threat now needed to fly beneath it, hugging terrain at 200 feet where ground clutter blinded Soviet radar and missiles couldn't track a fast-moving target against the Earth's surface. The Canberra couldn't do that. The wing loading and cockpit visibility assumed high-altitude flight, and the navigation equipment had never been designed for anything else. Sending Canberra crews into Soviet airspace at treetop level amounted to a suicide mission dressed up as a war plan. The smell of avgas and hot rubber hung permanently in the maintenance bays at RAF Marham and Honington, where ground crews kept aging Canberras flyable through increasingly creative engineering. Hydraulic seals leaked. Airframe fatigue cracks appeared in wings that had logged thousands of hours. These aircraft needed replacing regardless of the Soviet threat. But the Soviet threat dictated what the replacement had to do, and what it had to do bordered on science fiction for 1957. Fly at Mach 2 above 30,000 feet to reach the combat area. Descend to 200 feet. Sprint at Mach 1.2 or faster through valleys and over ridgelines using terrain-following radar that didn't exist yet. Find and strike a target using sensors that hadn't been invented. Survive long enough to egress. GOR 339 asked British industry to build an aircraft a full generation ahead of anything flying. Vickers Armstrongs and English Electric submitted a joint proposal. The Air Staff accepted it in January of 1959. Development began immediately, and the cost estimates started climbing before the ink dried. What happens when your closest ally builds something better than you? Not marginally better, not a slight edge in one performance category that can be argued away in a committee room. Better in every measurable dimension. Faster, lower, more precise, more survivable. That question landed on Robert McNamara's desk sometime in 1963, and the answer he arrived at tells you more about Cold War alliance politics than any treaty ever signed. The TSR-2 flew for the first time on September 27, 1964, with Roland Beaumont in the front seat and Don Bowen navigating behind him. Beaumont reported control difficulties during the initial takeoff roll. The rudder authority felt sluggish below rotation speed, and the undercarriage produced vibrations that shook the instrument panel hard enough to blur the gauges. These problems got fixed. What couldn't be fixed, from Washington's perspective, came next. Over the following months and 24 test flights, the TSR-2 demonstrated performance characteristics that made the General Dynamics F-111 look like yesterday's newspaper. Start with speed. The TSR-2 reached Mach 2.35 at altitude. The F-111 topped out around Mach 2.5 in its cleanest configuration, a marginal advantage that evaporated the moment you loaded external stores onto the aircraft. At low level, the environment both aircraft existed to fight in, the TSR-2 maintained Mach 1.2 at 200 feet. The F-111 managed Mach 1.2 as well, but its variable geometry wings produced drag penalties during the sweep transition that cost fuel and reduced combat radius. The British aircraft used a fixed delta wing configuration. Nothing moved, Nothing could fail during a low-level run at 12 miles a minute. Then, the avionics. BAC's nav-attack system integrated a forward-looking radar, a sideways-looking radar, and an inertial navigation platform into a single automated package that could guide the aircraft to a target without the crew ever looking outside the cockpit. The system updated its position fix continuously using terrain matching algorithms. The F-111's Mark I avionics suite attempted something similar, but relied on a less sophisticated terrain-following radar that required more pilot input and produced larger circular error probabilities on weapon delivery. The British system was autonomous in a way ours simply wasn't, a former General Dynamics engineer acknowledged in a 1992 oral history. The American aircraft needed its crew to compensate for what the computers couldn't do. Range compounded the disparity. The TSR-2 carried fuel internally for a combat radius of roughly 1,000 miles on a typical high-low-high mission profile. High-altitude transit, low-level penetration, high-altitude return. The F-111 achieved comparable range, only with external tanks that degraded its radar signature and low-level handling. Strip both aircraft to internal fuel, and the British machine flew farther, faster, and lower. The comparison gets worse for the Pentagon's procurement office. The TSR-2 also operated from rough, unprepared strips. Its landing gear incorporated a levered suspension system designed by Dowdy that absorbed the punishment of bombed-out runways and grass fields. NATO war planning assumed Soviet first strikes would crater every major airfield in Western Europe within the opening hours of a conflict. An aircraft that needed 8,000 feet of pristine concrete to get airborne, which described the F-111, became a very expensive lawn ornament the moment the first SS-4 missiles arrived. The TSR-2 needed 3,000 feet of anything reasonably flat. The F-111 cost more, too. By 1964, unit costs for the American aircraft had already breached $10 million and kept climbing through a development program plagued by structural failures in the wing carry-through box, a flaw that killed crews in Vietnam and grounded the fleet more than once. The TSR-2's projected unit cost sat around $5.7 million. The numbers moved around depending on production run assumptions, and British accounting methods differed enough from American ones that direct comparison carries some uncertainty. Sources conflict on the final per-unit figure, but no honest analysis put the TSR-2 above the F-111 in cost. Faster, farther, cheaper, operable from a farm field. McNamara's people could read a spec sheet as well as anyone. McNamara picked up the phone in December of 1964 and called Dennis Healy, the new defense secretary under Harold Wilson's Labor government. The conversation stayed off the official record. What landed on Healy's desk afterward did not. A detailed Pentagon assessment of the TSR-2 program arrived at the Ministry of Defense within days, and its conclusions read like an autopsy report for an aircraft that hadn't finished flight testing. Development costs had spiraled beyond control. The airframe carried unacceptable technical risk. The Olympus 22R engines suffered from compressor stall problems that might never be resolved. Britain should cancel the program immediately and purchase the F-111 at a preferential rate negotiated government to government, bypassing General Dynamics entirely. McNamara's office would guarantee delivery schedules and unit costs. The document contained projections so aggressively pessimistic about TSR-2 costs that BAC engineers who later reviewed them called the methodology fraudulent. Pentagon analysts had assumed a production run of only 46 aircraft, barely a third of the RAF's stated requirement of 138, and then divided total development expenditure across that reduced number to inflate the per-unit price. The math is simple and dishonest. You can make any aircraft look unaffordable if you cut the production run low enough. The actual per-unit cost at full production sat dramatically lower, and McNamara's analysts certainly knew that. They chose not to present it. Healy listened. He had reasons to listen that extended well beyond the aircraft itself. Sterling had weakened against the dollar through most of 1964, and the Wilson government depended on American cooperation to defend the currency. The Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department controlled access to dollar-denominated credit facilities that kept Britain's balance of payments from collapsing outright. Nobody in Washington ever said the words, "Cancel the TSR-2 or we let sterling fall." Nobody needed to. Healy understood the architecture of dependency he operated within, and McNamara understood that Healy understood. The NATO standardization argument came next, and it arrived through different channels, not McNamara directly, but through the Supreme Allied Commander Europe's staff at SHAPE headquarters in Belgium. The logic sounded reasonable on its surface. NATO allies operating the same aircraft simplified logistics, reduced spare parts inventories, enabled common training programs, strengthened interoperability during wartime. If Britain, West Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands all flew the F-111, a squadron from RAF Germany could share munitions and maintenance with a Luftwaffe unit operating from the next airfield. Sensible stuff. The part nobody mentioned aloud concerned what standardization actually meant in practice. Every NATO Air Force buying American, every defense dollar flowing back to Fort Worth, Texas, every allied nation surrendering its capacity to design and build frontline combat aircraft. Standardization and monopoly wore the same uniform. An odd detail surfaces in the correspondence from this period. Julian Amery, the conservative aviation minister who championed the TSR-2 before Labour took power, kept a file of letters exchanged between BAC executives and their counterparts at General Dynamics during 1963. The American company had quietly proposed a joint venture. BAC would build F-111 fuselage sections under license, receiving a share of production work in exchange for dropping the TSR-2. BAC refused. The letters vanished from the archive after October of that year, and Amery's file contains a handwritten note in the margin. GD went over their heads. What that means, specifically, stays unclear. But the pressure campaign's most effective weapon had nothing to do with cost figures or alliance politics. McNamara offered Wilson's government something irresistible, a way to kill the TSR-2 and blame the decision on fiscal responsibility rather than American coercion. The cancellation could be dressed as tough-minded labor economics, a new government cleaning up Tory procurement excess. Wilson needed to cut defense spending to fund domestic programs. McNamara handed him the knife and pointed at the patient. The political cover worked so well that for decades afterward, most accounts of the cancellation treated it as a purely British decision, driven by purely British budgetary constraints. The American fingerprints got wiped clean. Healy announced the cancellation on April 6, 1965, during his Defense White Paper speech to the House of Commons. He cited escalating costs and the availability of the F-111 as a proven alternative, a generous description of an aircraft that had yet to enter service and carried its own catastrophic development problems. No conversation with McNamara appeared in the speech. The Pentagon's cost assessment, its manipulated production assumptions, sterling dollar credit facilities, the Federal Reserve, none of it made the record. The Hansard transcript runs to several thousand words. The American pressure campaign occupies 0 of them. The order to destroy the airframes followed within weeks. And that order, not the cancellation itself, reveals the real anxiety. You don't burn the evidence when you've merely changed your mind. You burn it when you need to make sure nobody changes it back. September 27, 1964, 2:47 in the afternoon. XR-219 rolled onto Boscombe Downs main runway with Beaumont holding the brakes against 28,000 pounds of Olympus thrust. The concrete trembled. Ground crew standing behind blast barriers felt the vibration through their boot soles before they heard it, a low-frequency pulse that settled somewhere behind the sternum and stayed there. Beaumont released the brakes. The acceleration pinned him and Don Bowen into their Martin Baker seats as XR-219 gathered speed down 10,000 feet of Wiltshire tarmac. At 140 knots, the nose wheel came up. At 165, the main gear lifted free, and for the first time in history, a TSR-2 flew. The undercarriage vibration kicked in almost immediately, a lateral shudder that Beaumont later compared to driving a car with a badly warped wheel. The instrument panel danced. He couldn't read the engine gauges cleanly, so he flew by feel and by the sound of two Olympus 22Rs burning clean behind him. That sound filled the cockpit like standing inside a cathedral organ tuned to one enormous chord. Bowen called out altitude and airspeed from the rear seat because his instruments shook less violently than the front panel. They climbed to 10,000 feet and held it. No heroics on the first flight. Beaumont tested roll response, pitch authority, engine handling at reduced power settings. The aircraft responded with a precision that startled him. "She flew like she'd been flying for years," he told a BBC interviewer 3 decades later. The controls carried a crispness he hadn't felt in any other British aircraft. Not the Lightning, not the Canberra, and not in any of the prototypes he'd wrestled through first flights for English Electric across 15 years of test work. Why does that matter? Because an aircraft that handles beautifully on its first flight almost never does. First flights expose compromises, reveal flutter boundaries, punish optimistic stress calculations. Test pilots expect to fight the machine. Beaumont fought the undercarriage vibration, which turned out to be a damper setting problem fixed within weeks. Everything else worked. The aerodynamics matched the wind tunnel predictions. The engines delivered rated thrust. The flight control system behaved exactly as the engineers at Weybridge and Wharton had promised. All of it confirmed what the design team had been telling anyone who would listen. 14 minutes after takeoff, Beaumont brought XR-219 back around for approach. The Wiltshire countryside spread out below in late September, greens and golds, hedgerows casting long afternoon shadows across fields that hadn't changed since the Spitfire flew from this same patch of ground 24 years earlier. He crossed the threshold at 155 knots, planted the main gear, and rolled to a stop. The debrief lasted hours. The celebration lasted longer. BAC engineers who'd spent 6 years on the project allowed themselves to believe they'd built something that could survive its enemies in Whitehall and Washington. They couldn't have known that McNamara's cost assessment had already reached draft stage at the Pentagon. The phone call to Healy sat 10 weeks in the future. The cancellation order, 6 months. Every subsequent test flight, 23 more of them, expanding the envelope and confirming the performance predictions one sortie at a time, amounted to an autopsy performed on a living patient. The aircraft kept proving it could do everything the RAF needed. The people who decided its fate had stopped caring about what it could do before Beaumont ever left the ground. The red box measured 14 inches by 9, covered in scarlet Morocco leather with the royal cipher stamped in gold on the lid. Dennis Healy carried it into the House of Commons on April 6, 1965, tucked under his left arm. Inside sat the defense white paper, 32 pages of fiscal austerity that would gut British aerospace for a generation. The leather smelled faintly of polish. The pages smelled like nothing at all. Healy rose to speak at 3:28 in the afternoon. His voice carried the flat Yorkshire confidence of a man who'd already made peace with what he had to say. The TSR-2 program, he announced, stood cancelled with immediate effect. Rising costs had made the aircraft unaffordable. The government would instead purchase the F-111 from the United States at a guaranteed unit price, filling the RAF's strike requirement with a proven design. He used the word proven twice. The F-111 had not yet entered operational service with anyone, including the United States Air Force. Its wing carry-through box kept cracking during fatigue tests at General Dynamics. But Healy said proven, and Hansard recorded it, and that became the official position of Her Majesty's government. The House erupted. Conservative backbenchers shouted. Labour members sat in disciplined silence. Sir Reginald Verdon-Smith, BAC's chairman, listened to the broadcast from his office in Pall Mall and reportedly said nothing for several minutes. At Wharton, where the production line employed 4,700 workers, the tannoy announcement came at 4:15. Men put down their tools and stood next to aircraft that no longer existed as a program. Some walked to the car park immediately. Others finished riveting whatever panel they'd started that morning, because stopping mid-task felt worse than continuing work on a dead machine. If Wilson had waited 6 months, just 6, XR-219 would have completed its full flight envelope expansion and demonstrated the low-level terrain-following capability that justified the entire program. Beaumont believed the aircraft would have become politically uncancelable once the RAF saw what it could do at 200 feet. But that's speculation dressed as logic. Wilson didn't wait. Anyway, the destruction order arrived at Wharton and Weybridge within 3 weeks. The ministry specified destruction, not storage, not mothballing. The Ministry of Defense instructed BAC to cut apart every airframe on the production line, every jig, every tooling fixture specific to the TSR-2. Blowtorches and bandsaws did the work. Fuselage sections that had taken months to assemble came apart in hours. Wing spars designed to withstand 9G maneuvering loads yielded to cutting wheels operated by the same men who'd built them. "They made us kill our own children," a Wharton shop steward told the Lancashire Evening Post. His word, children. Healy never presented the real cost comparison to Parliament. The TSR-2's all-up development cost through cancellation ran to approximately £195 million. Total. For that investment, Britain possessed a flying aircraft that met or exceeded every line of GOR 339, plus a production line capable of delivering airframes at a rate of 4 per month. The F-111 purchase, announced simultaneously, carried an estimated price tag of £300 million for 50 aircraft, roughly £6 million per unit, delivered from Fort Worth with no British industrial participation beyond some electronic subsystems. Weight for weight, the TSR-2 cost less per pound of airframe than the F-111 by a margin of nearly 40%. Pound for pound, capability for capability, the British aircraft outperformed the American one in the mission profile. Both existed to fly. Healy bought the more expensive, less capable aircraft from a foreign manufacturer and called it fiscal responsibility. 3 years later, in January of 1968, Wilson canceled the F-111 order too. Sterling had collapsed despite American support. The balance of payments crisis McNamara's people had dangled as leverage consumed the very program they'd offered as replacement. Britain got neither aircraft. The RAF flew Canberras and Buccaneers into the 1980s, subsonic aircraft designed in the 1940s and 50s, threading through Soviet air defenses that grew denser and more lethal with each passing year. At Wharton, the empty production hall stood for months before other work filled it. Rain leaked through the roof where the loading doors no longer sealed properly. The puddles collected on concrete floors still marked with chalk lines, showing where TSR-2 number 9 should have taken shape. February 2, 1966, 10 months after the TSR-2 cancellation. The British government signed a memorandum of understanding with the United States for 50 F-111K aircraft, the K denoting a variant modified to British specifications. Unit price? $5.95 million, fixed. McNamara's personal guarantee backed the number. The contract language used the phrase firm ceiling price, 3 words that would age like milk left on a radiator. General Dynamics began work on the British modifications at Fort Worth. The RAF wanted a different nav-attack system, a reconnaissance palette for the weapons bay, compatibility with British nuclear weapons, and strengthened landing gear for rough field operations. Every modification generated engineering changes, and every engineering change generated cost. The firm ceiling price developed cracks almost immediately, hairline fractures that widened with every quarterly review until the whole structure threatened to come apart, exactly like the wing carry-through box that had plagued the base F-111 design from the start. By mid-1967, the unit price had climbed past $7 million. By autumn, it exceeded $8 million. The $5.95 million guarantee McNamara had extended with such confidence turned out to carry qualifications buried in annexes that nobody in Whitehall had read carefully enough. Cost growth attributable to British specified modifications fell outside the ceiling. Since virtually every modification qualified as British specified, virtually every cost increase fell outside the ceiling. The guarantee protected against nothing. It existed to get a signature on a page, and it succeeded at that single task admirably. Harold Wilson's cabinet received the updated cost projections in November of 1967, 4 days after sterling's devaluation from $2.80 to $2.40. That devaluation, the one McNamara's leverage had supposedly helped prevent, increased the pound-denominated cost of every F-111K by 16.7% overnight. The aircraft that replaced the TSR-2 on grounds of affordability now cost more than the TSR-2 would have cost at full production. Wilson went on television and told the British public that the pound in their pocket had not been devalued. The pounds committed to General Dynamics told a different story. Dennis Healy fought to keep the order alive through December and into the new year. He'd staked his credibility on the F-111K as the rational alternative to British-built excess. Canceling it meant admitting the entire strategic logic of April 1965 had collapsed, that he'd killed a working British aircraft to buy a more expensive American one that he now couldn't afford either. The political mathematics of that admission exceeded anything Healy could absorb. He argued for a reduced order of 26 aircraft. The Treasury blocked him. 26 F-111Ks at the revised price exceeded the budget allocation for 50 at the original price. Even McNamara's creative accounting couldn't make that arithmetic work. January 16, 1968. Healy stood in the Commons again. Same dispatch box, same flat Yorkshire delivery. The F-111K order, he announced, stood cancelled. No American strike aircraft would be purchased. No British strike aircraft would be built. Britain would make do with what it had. What it had consisted of Canberras designed in 1946 and Buccaneers designed in 1952. Fine aircraft in their era, hopelessly outmatched by the integrated air defense networks the Soviet Union deployed across Eastern Europe through the 1970s. SA-6 batteries and MiG-21 interceptors that TSR-2 would have evaded at treetop height and Mach 1.1 now faced subsonic targets flying predictable approach profiles because nothing else existed in the RAF inventory to fly the mission. The gap lasted 17 years, from 1965, when the TSR-2 died, to 1982, when the first Tornado GR-1 squadron reached operational capability at RAF Marham. The Royal Air Force lacked a modern, low-level supersonic strike platform. 17 years during which NATO's northern flank depended partly on British aircraft that Soviet air defenses had been specifically designed to kill. Squadron commanders at RAF Larbruck and RAF Bruggen in West Germany trained their Buccaneer crews to fly at 200 feet because altitude meant death. But even at 200 feet, a subsonic aircraft crossing defended airspace follows a timeline that SA-6 radar operators can predict and exploit. The crews knew the exchange rates. They trained anyway. McNamara left the Pentagon in February of 1968, 5 weeks after the F-111K cancellation, to become president of the World Bank. His departure attracted extensive commentary about Vietnam, about cost-benefit analysis applied to warfare, about the limits of quantitative management. Almost nobody mentioned the TSR-2. The program he'd worked so effectively to destroy had produced exactly the outcome he'd promised to prevent. A weaker ally, a capability gap measured in decades, 300 million pounds spent on nothing delivered to anybody, and a Royal Air Force planning to fight the next war with the last generation's aircraft. XR-22. O sits at Cosford behind a rope barrier, its intake lips gathering dust instead of air. XR-222 stands at Duxford Imperial War Museum's American Air Museum, a British aircraft housed in a building dedicated to American air power. Either a curator with a dark sense of humor made that decision, or nobody thought about it at all. The records don't say which. Before the TSR-2, Britain designed and built its own fighters and bombers, its own tactical strike aircraft. The Spitfire, the Mosquito, the Vulcan, the Lightning, each conceived on British drawing boards, powered by British engines, flown from British factories to British squadrons without asking permission from anyone. After the TSR-2, that capability evaporated so completely that most people alive today don't realize it ever existed. The Tornado arrived in 1982 as a trinational project with West Germany and Italy, a fine aircraft built by committee, its development shaped by compromise between three air staffs with three different operational requirements. The Typhoon followed the same model with 4 nations involved, and took 23 years from requirement to operational service. The F-35, which now forms the backbone of RAF combat power, flies out of Fort Worth on American engines with American software, governed by American export controls. If Washington decides tomorrow that Britain shouldn't fly those aircraft, Britain stops flying them. You can't sovereignty your way around a firmware lock. That dependency began on April 6, 1965. It arrived all at once, not through slow institutional decline. Healy signed it into existence with a single budgetary decision, backed by American pressure, that arrived wrapped in the language of Allied cooperation. McNamara called it rationalization. Rationalization meant Britain builds what America allows Britain to build. The TSR-2 proved the British aerospace industry could produce a world-beating combat aircraft independently. Its cancellation proved that technical excellence carries no political weight when your closest ally decides your success threatens their market share. Roland Beaumont died in November of 2001 at 80 years old. His logbook recorded 24 TSR-2 flights, totaling just over 13 hours of flight time. 13 hours to prove an aircraft could do everything asked of it. The test program generated enough performance data to confirm that the production TSR-2 would have outperformed every tactical strike aircraft in the Western inventory through the mid-1980s. Beaumont spent his final decades giving lectures about the aircraft to aviation societies and museum groups, standing beside XR-222 at Duxford, resting one hand on the fuselage skin while he talked. The aluminum held whatever temperature the hangar gave it. It could do everything the F-111 could do, and do it better. Beaumont said that in 1985, 20 years after cancellation, standing in front of a crowd at the Royal Aeronautical Society, he paused after the sentence, the way a man pauses when he's said something he knows cannot be argued with and wants the silence to confirm it. The audience, engineers, pilots, civil servants, some of whom had worked the program, didn't clap. They just sat there. The flight data supported every word. Beaumont knew it. They knew it. And McNamara knew it too. That clarity, that hard, specific aerodynamic certainty formed the entire basis of the American campaign against the TSR-2. The aircraft threatened nothing militarily. Britain pointed its weapons east, same as America. The threat ran along a different axis entirely. Industrial independence. A Britain capable of designing, building, and exporting a strike aircraft superior to anything in the American inventory became a Britain that didn't need permission or favors, didn't need the F-111 or the political obligations attached to purchasing it. America won the Cold War, won it technologically, won it economically, won it when the Soviet Union collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions in 1991. Part of winning required maintaining absolute dominance over the Western Alliance's defense industrial base, ensuring that NATO operated American equipment. Thought in American doctrinal categories depended on American logistics chains. That strategy demanded casualties, and the TSR-2 became one of them. The program died not because it failed, but because it succeeded in ways that made American monopoly harder to sustain. Was McNamara wrong? Strategically, no. A fragmented Western aerospace industry producing competing designs for the same mission set would have wasted resources NATO couldn't afford, while the Soviet Union fielded new aircraft types every 4 years. Consolidation and standardization both made sense. The cold logic of alliance management pointed exactly where McNamara pointed it. He ran the numbers, and the numbers said American primacy served the alliance better than British independence. The numbers were probably right. The cost fell on specific people. Jimmy Dell, BAC's chief test pilot after Beaumont, flew the TSR-2 11 times and then watched the program evaporate beneath him. He transferred to other projects, spent years on the Jaguar and Tornado programs, multinational aircraft designed by consensus, none of them quite what any single Air Force wanted. The 4,700 workers at Wharton scattered across the British aerospace industry or left it entirely. Skilled men who'd hand-fitted titanium engine bay panels to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch went to work building car parts or fitting kitchens. Their expertise, specific, irreplaceable, built up over years of working at the boundary of what metallurgy and aerodynamics allowed, dispersed like heat from cooling metal. Once gone, it didn't come back. Britain never again attempted a solo combat aircraft program. The industrial base that could have supported one had been dismantled with blowtorches on ministry orders. The Soviet Union built the MiG-23, the MiG-25, the Su-24. Each generation faster, more capable, harder to intercept. NATO countered with American aircraft flown by Allied pilots trained to American standards using American weapons. The system worked, the alliance held, and the wall came down. McNamara's logic, brutal and transactional, contemptuous of sentiment, delivered the outcome it promised. The West won as a bloc under American leadership with American hardware. At Cosford, XR-22O rests on its landing gear with the cockpit roped off and the engine bays open to museum air. The instrument panel carries a thin film of condensation on cold mornings, moisture settling on gauges that last registered airspeed on a January afternoon in 1965. A small placard mounted on the rope stanchion identifies the aircraft by type and serial number. Beneath the serial number, someone has typed the total flight hours, 13.